Good morning. So, switching a little bit from JP's remarks to stories about firms, stories about companies and the responsibilities of companies. Let me just start with two stories of irresponsibility that you're probably very familiar with. Firstly, the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, where a rig operated by BP exploded, killing 11 people and causing an environmental catastrophe in the Gulf. One story. Second story of irresponsibility then, perhaps a little closer to home, is the VW Emission Scandal. Right, that engineers at VW programmed vehicles, over 11 million of them, to cheat on vehicle emissions tests. The software detected when the vehicle was being tested for emissions and very cleverly lowered those emissions. And then when the vehicle was on the road, it gave out up to 40 times the permitted amount of pollution. With both of those stories, I'd like to ask you to think a little bit about who is responsible. So we blame the businesses, right? We say BP caused this disaster in the Gulf, that VW cheated on the emissions tests. But I'd like to pose this question: are we actually correct when we ascribe responsibility to the organizations for these acts of misconduct? When we say we can blame BP, blame VW. So in legal terms, at least under Anglo-American law, it's fairly straightforward that the corporation is identified as a legal person. But the question we might ask is it also a moral person? And what does that mean to be a moral person? There's an interesting side note here in relation to Germany, because, of course, there's no corporate criminal liability in Germany, though this is not to say that you don't, in other ways, think of the corporation, the firm, as being a person. So in relation to bankruptcy, in relation to privacy, for example. So what we're talking about here is what's known in the trade of business ethics as corporate moral agency. And what I'm going to share with you is some of the thinking that's in this book that came out last year. And what this book does is ask, can we really identify a corporation or any other business entity as being a moral agent, and therefore be held accountable for its actions? And in part what we're asking here is, can it act autonomously? Can it form moral judgments? And can it respond in light of those judgments? Or rather, instead, is it not right to blame the individuals? That it's the individuals inside the organization, not the corporation itself, that is indeed responsible. And in giving these different perspectives, I'm going to draw on the different contributions to this book, and so I thank the various contributors for many of the ideas that I'm going to share with you today. So let's start with one side of the debate, and that is that responsibility lies solely with the individual. That everything an organization does is the causal result of what individuals have put into play. And so if you think about it, think about a comparison here. I don't know whether you can still buy wind-up toys, but you know, the sort that you can wind up with some sort of clockwork mechanism inside. If a child puts that on a table at a party where there are lots of drinks on the table and the glasses get knocked over and the drinks get spilled, do you blame the toy for the drinks getting spilled? Or do you blame the child, or perhaps the child's parents? So only individual human beings can be morally responsible. The actions of the firm are those of the individual members. That's how this argument, that's how this perspective goes. It's not to say there aren't influences by the organization, so there may be things that the organization does that influences people's behavior, but it's ultimately individuals who are responsible. And if we say otherwise, there's a risk here that possibly we're saying, well, it's all to do with the organization, all to do with the firm, and no individual is at all responsible for the outcome. So that it is BP or VW that's to blame, not the individual engineers who were involved in those scandals. And so there's a danger that we might actually end up blaming the firm, and this can have some pretty negative consequences, right? Because it lets individuals off the hook. They're not being held to account for what they've done. And who does end up paying? So if you sanction organizations, who's paying? Well, it may be their shareholders, their customers, employees who are innocent in terms of what actually happened. And as a result of this, you take away the incentive for people not to engage in misconduct. They can instead do what they've always done if they've been engaged in misconduct and blame the organization, nothing to do with them. We can look at this more fundamentally in terms of the criteria that we identify for moral agency. So what is it that makes a moral agent? Well, let me just note, slightly humorously perhaps, you may remember from the US presidential campaign in 2012, the unsuccessful presidential candidate Mitt Romney said, corporations are people too. Well, corporations are not people, right? We ask, as we did earlier, can they act autonomously? Can they form moral judgments? Can they respond in light of those judgments? Surely the answer is no. For an agent to be morally responsible, they must have action ability, they must have intention ability, they must have autonomy. And for some people, autonomy alone, or the lack of autonomy in a corporation, debunks this idea of corporate moral agency. Other people come at the argument a little bit differently, but with the same result. So some people say, surely, if we are making some sort of ethical judgment, there needs to be emotion. We need to be able to understand right and wrong by incorporating emotion. Now, I hear you saying, maybe to yourselves and quietly, but hang on a minute, not so fast. Isn't there something about organizations where we can really, to some extent, pin the blame and ascribe responsibility? So there is a sense that there's something about organizations that means they are capable of doing things. Excuse me. And what I like to quote here, and this is the very first quote in the book, is an extract from the book by John Steinbeck, Grapes of Wrath. You may know that already. It's a story about how people in the Dust Bowl states, as they were in the middle of the US in the 1930s, time of depression, a time when the climatic conditions were not good for farmers, they had to migrate west. Before they migrated west, they were essentially kicked off their land. And there's this great quote there's this great quote in the book from Grapes of Wrath, and let me just share this with you. So, "Sure," cried the tenant men, "but it's our land. We were born on it, and we got killed on it, died on it. Even if it's no good, it's still ours. That's what makes ownership, not a paper with numbers on it. We're sorry, it's not us, it's the monster. The bank isn't like a man." "Yes, but the bank is only made of men." "No, you're wrong there, quite wrong there. The bank is something else than men. It happens that every man in the bank hates what the bank does, and yet the bank does it. The bank is something more than men. I tell you, it's the monster. Men made it, but they can't control it." And I think that passage illustrates very nicely this idea that surely in some sense, organizations are responsible. So let me just turn to the other argument then, the opposing view around organizational responsibility. So the idea here is that there's some sort of collective intentionality. That in some ways, putting together the acts of individuals creates something beyond those individuals themselves. That if you like, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And in the very earliest writing on corporate moral agency, Peter French wrote about what he called the corporate internal decision structure, that there's something that's created separate from the individuals that make up the organization. And building on that work in more recent years, you've got philosophers like Michael Bratman, who talks about group intentions and identifies how groups of people, small groups or big groups, if we're thinking about large companies, can in some ways come together and act, even if some of the people in the group don't necessarily entirely agree with the intentions that the group as a whole might have. And in a different vein, the philosopher Philip Pettit has talked about corporations as having a voice that in some ways represents that organization and in a way that is distinct from the members of that organization. And so these are some of the arguments that are advanced for organizational responsibility. The idea that there is something separate from the individuals that make up the organization. And what these proponents say is that when it comes to individuals, they can also be responsible as well as the organization. So we don't necessarily have to have a situation where we say, it's the corporation to blame, end of story. We can also say that individuals are to blame too. And so if you look at the stories of BP, you look at the stories of VW, you can say, yes, it's got something to do with the engineers that were involved in those decisions at the root, but also the organization as well. So if you think about the VW story a little bit, let's assume that the senior management of VW didn't know about how the software was being programmed. That might be a rash assumption in light of some of the information that's emerged, but just imagine that they didn't know. But what they did know, and what we all know, is that 10 years before this happened, they were saying to their employees, we're going to make VW the largest automobile manufacturer in the world. And they were going from a situation in 2006 where they had sales of 6 million vehicles to 10 years later, 10 million vehicles, becoming that largest automobile manufacturer in the world. What does it mean for the people within the organization if that's the overriding goal that they're being asked to follow? And so I think when we start saying individuals are responsible, we also need to look at what's happening in terms of the organization, in terms of the pressures put on those individuals especially. And let's note that it's not always possible to identify who is responsible. So let me come to some conclusions, some implications of this debate, and some conclusions. Give you a sense of where I stand on it. So I think you can say theoretically, and this is the position that I take, a strong case can be made for the moral responsibility of firms, or more formally, for corporate moral agency. But it's only in a narrow and circumscribed way that avoids anthropomorphization, which I don't know how well that translates, but basically means avoiding trying to characterize firms as if they are people. A firm is more than the sum of its parts. But that does not preclude individual moral responsibility. And we're right to be concerned about corporate misconduct and individuals going unsanctioned for corporate misconduct. And some people would say what we should be doing, and I have a fair degree of sympathy for this view, is doing a whole lot more to punish individuals because that's going to be a more effective deterrent when it comes to misconduct. I say that attention should be given to both, that we should be giving attention to both the individuals and the corporation when it comes to thinking about responsibility. So that good and bad corporate behavior is profoundly influenced by the extent to which individuals and the corporate entity itself are held responsible. People respond to being told that they are responsible, organizations too. And there are things that organizations can do more of, particularly when it comes to thinking about culture and creating a culture where bad behavior is not ignored, is acted upon, and is certainly not condoned, and where that misconduct is attributed not just to individuals, but to organizational factors as well. And let me just conclude on a positive note, because I've been telling you all these bad stories about the terrible things that business does. Let's not forget also that business can do good things. So I think, for example, about how pharmaceutical companies can create access to essential medicines. That is being responsible, and that's not just the responsibility of individuals, it's the responsibility of organizations too. On that, let me conclude and leave you to decide where you stand on this question. Thank you.